It was the autumn of 1987 when 27-year-old Claire Beaumont found herself standing alone in a pasture that stretched to the horizon in every direction, holding a set of keys that suddenly weighed more than anything she had ever carried. Her father, Henri Beaumont, had died on a Tuesday. The ground was still soft from September rain when they buried him in the churchyard, at the edge of Lac Saint-Jean, Quebec, under a sky the color of old pewter. He had left her 900 acres of mixed farmland, hay fields, a small herd of beef cattle, a woodlot, and a collection of machinery that had seen better decades. He had also left her in debt. Not catastrophic debt, not the kind that breaks a family in a single season, but the kind that sits quiet and steady on the kitchen table every morning, like an unwelcome guest who has memorized where you keep the coffee. Her brother-in-law, Mark, had made his position clear at the reception. He had pulled her aside in the narrow hallway of the farmhouse, his voice low and managed, the way a man speaks when he has already decided something and just needs to notify you. "Claire," he said, "you know I have nothing but respect for what Henri built here. But you're 27 years old and you're on your own. There are buyers out of Montreal who are looking at exactly this kind of land. We should at least have a conversation." She had looked at him for a long moment. Then she had walked back to the kitchen to refill her coffee, and that was the end of that conversation. Let me tell you about the farm she had inherited. It was not a disaster. It was not a triumph either. It was something in between, which is perhaps the most honest way to describe most farms in the Quebec interior in the late 1980s. Henri Beaumont had been a careful man, careful in the way men are when they have seen their own fathers lose things they could not get back. He had never borrowed more than he could repay in 2 seasons. He had never bought equipment he didn't understand, and he had kept records of everything, every repair, every purchase, every yield per field, going back to 1961, in a series of green ledger books that sat in a wooden crate beside his desk like a library no one else had ever thought to read. What the farm did have in abundance was deferred work. The hay baler had a timing problem that had been getting worse since spring. The tractor, a 1974 Massey Ferguson 165, burned oil at a rate that Henri had been managing with careful attention and regular top-ups, but that was now threatening to become something more serious, and the fencing along the north pasture, where the cattle wintered, had been patched and repatched until it was more patch than fence. The neighbors watched. They were kind people, most of them, the kind that comes with decades of living close to other people's hard seasons. They watched because they couldn't help it. A young woman alone on 900 acres with aging equipment and no hired hand was the sort of thing people in a small farming community notice the way they notice a change in the weather. They spoke about her without meanness, but they spoke. The consensus, gentle as it was that she would need help she couldn't afford, or she would need to sell. The week after the funeral, Claire drove into Roberval to see Mr. Tanguay at the credit union. He was a man with a soft voice and the tired eyes of someone who has had too many difficult conversations in a pleasant office. He had known her father. He offered her tea, which she accepted, and then he arranged some papers on his desk in the way people do when they are organizing their thoughts before delivering news. "Your father's operating line is manageable," he said. "But with the equipment situation and the fencing, you're looking at expenses before you see any income. The cattle need to go to winter pasture in 6 weeks." He paused. "There are options, Claire. The land market is strong right now. A partial sale, even just the East Quarter, would clear everything and give you working capital." She looked at him with the same steadiness she had shown Mark at the reception. "I'm not selling any of it," she said. He nodded slowly. He was not an unkind man. He believed what he was seeing was grief, and he made an allowance for it. "Think about it," he said. "The offer will hold." She drove home on the highway with the window down and the smell of the lake coming in from the west. She was not thinking about the offer. She was thinking about the baler. Now, here is something I want you to understand about Henri Beaumont, because you cannot understand his daughter without understanding him first. He was not a sentimental man. He did not frame things in the barn or keep photographs on the tractor dash. But he was a man who believed with a complete and unargued certainty that the most valuable thing a person could possess was the ability to fix what broke, not to replace it, not to hire someone else to look at it, to understand it well enough, deeply enough, that when it failed you, you could open it up, find the failure, and correct it with your own hands. He had started teaching Claire when she was 9 years old, not in a formal way. Henri was not a formal man, but the way you teach someone when the work is simply happening and you bring them alongside it. He would be lying on his back under the massey, and he would say, without preamble, "Hand me the 3/8 socket. Now come down here and look at this. You see where the gasket is weeping? That's not a catastrophe. That's a conversation. The engine is telling you something. Your job is to learn the language." He had a phrase he used so often it had lost its edges in her memory, the way a word does when you've said it 1,000 times. Buying a new one is expensive. Understanding the old one is free. He said it about tractors. He said it about fence posts. He said it once, memorably, about a marriage, though that was a different story. What he left her, beyond the land and the debt and the green ledger books, was a tool chest that stood against the north wall of the workshop, like a piece of furniture that had grown there. It was a large red snap-on chest, its surface worn to a dull finish by 30 years of greasy hands. Every drawer was organized with a precision that was almost aggressive. Every wrench in sequence, every socket in its labeled tray. When Claire was a teenager, she had once moved a 1/2-inch ratchet to the wrong drawer by accident. Henri had found it within 10 minutes without looking for it, simply by reaching for it and finding it absent. He had replaced it without a word, but the look on his face had been instruction enough. There was also the shelf of manuals, service manuals, operators' manuals, parts catalogs, their spines cracked, their pages soft and dark at the edges from handling, and tucked into the back of the Massey Ferguson service manual, folded into quarters, was something Claire found on the 3rd evening, after the funeral when she went to the workshop, because she didn't know where else to go. She had gone out there in the dark, not to work, just to be somewhere that smelled like him, diesel and cold metal, and the faint wood smoke ghost of 100 autumn evenings. She turned on the single overhead light and stood in the middle of the workshop and looked at the machines and let the silence be whatever it needed to be. Then she pulled the Massey manual off the shelf because the baler problem was connected to the PTO and she wanted to see the diagram. And the folded paper fell out and landed on the concrete floor at her feet. His handwriting was blocky and deliberate, the handwriting of a man who wrote slowly because he believed words were worth the time. It said, "The farm doesn't owe you anything. It never did. But if you're patient with it and honest with it, and you don't ask it to be something it isn't, it will hold. It always holds. The work is not the burden. The work is the answer to the burden." She stood there for a long time. The light buzzed faintly above her. Outside, one of the cattle shifted and the fence wire clinked once in the dark. Then she opened the manual to the PTO section and got to work. The baler problem turned out to be a shear bolt issue, compounded by a worn pickup tooth that had been throwing the timing off for the better part of a season. It was not a complicated repair. It was the kind of repair that looks complicated until someone who knows the machine gets their hands on it and then it resolves itself into a sequence of sensible steps. Claire worked through it over 2 days, cross-referencing the manual and one of Henri's green ledger books, where he had noted a similar issue in 1983 with a parts reference she was able to use at the dealer in Alma. The total cost of parts was $43 and some change. The Massey was a longer project. The oil consumption pointed to worn piston rings, which pointed to a partial engine rebuild, which was, on paper, the kind of thing you sent out to a shop and received an invoice for that made you feel briefly ill. Henri had rebuilt engines before. She had watched him do it once, when she was 17, a cold March weekend in the workshop, with the manual open on a stand and the radio playing quietly, and both of them in layers, because the wood stove couldn't keep up with the drafts. She had handed him tools and held things steady, and watched the engine come apart and come back together like a very slow and greasy puzzle. She called a retired mechanic named Mr. Corriveau, who had done work for Henri over the years, and who agreed, for a modest sum and the pleasure of the thing, to come out on Saturday mornings and work alongside her while she learned what she needed to learn. He was a patient teacher. He did not explain things twice because he assumed she had not understood. He explained things in different ways because he understood that knowledge has more than one entrance. The rebuild took most of October. When it was finished and the engine turned over clean and strong, Mr. Corriveau wiped his hands on a rag and said, "Your father would find no fault with that." It was, coming from him, the highest possible remark. The first winter was a study in reduction. Claire did not spend money that wasn't there. She did not replace what could be repaired. She bartered 2 days of fencing labor with a neighbor, Patrice, for the use of his post pounder to finish the north line before freeze-up. She sold firewood from the woodlot, cut and split herself on cold November mornings to bring in enough for the December fuel bill. She ate simply and slept early and rose before the dark had decided whether it was still night or the beginning of something else. The credit union line crept down slowly in the increments that feel invisible month to month but accumulate into something visible over a year. The town watched. The talk at the co-op and the diner and the hockey rink was not unkind, but it carried the quiet certainty of people who have seen this particular story before and know how it usually ends. A woman alone on that place with Henri's old equipment. It's too much for one person. It's a shame, really. What they were not seeing was her ledger. Let me tell you about the moment she almost quit, because every true story has one, and anyone who tells you theirs doesn't is either lying or hasn't been paying attention. It was February. A cold snap had come down from the northwest and settled in with the kind of commitment that makes you rethink basic assumptions about the relationship between humans and the natural world. The water line to the cattle trough in the north pasture froze solid. Claire discovered this at 6 in the morning when she went out to check on the herd and found them standing in a loose, miserable cluster, looking at a trough that wasn't giving them anything. She spent the next 4 hours with heat tape and a propane torch working her way along the buried line in -30 wind chill, her hands losing feeling in cycles, numb, then burning, then numb again. She got it thawed. She wrapped it properly and got the water running. Then she walked back to the farmhouse, sat down at the kitchen table, and looked at nothing for a while. The offer from the Montreal buyers was still technically open. Mr. Tanguay had mentioned it again in December, gently, almost apologetically. A partial sale, a fresh start. She could be done with this. She could be warm. She could be somewhere that didn't require her to conduct delicate plumbing surgery in conditions that were actively hostile to human life. She thought about her father's letter for a long time. The work is not the burden. The work is the answer to the burden. She made herself a coffee. She went back outside to check that the heat tape was holding. It was. She went to the workshop and ran through the service checklist on the tractor because it was due and because there is something centering about methodical work when everything else feels like it's trying to knock you sideways. She did not call Mr. Tangway. Spring came the way it always does in Quebec, grudgingly at first, then all at once, as if the season is embarrassed about having kept everyone waiting. The fields came out of the snow looking better than she expected. Henri had always been meticulous about his soil. He believed in cover crops the way some men believe in religion. And he'd planted winter rye across the main hay fields the September before he died. And now it was coming up clean and green and dense, holding the topsoil against the spring runoff, feeding the biology that made everything else possible. Her first full hay harvest that summer was not remarkable for its size. It was modest, honest production from fields that were being well tended but not pushed. What she noticed was that her input costs, fuel, fertilizer, the small amounts she used, were significantly lower than what she overheard her neighbors discussing at the co-op. She was not buying her way to a yield. She was growing one. The cattle went to market in October, and she settled the operating line at the credit union completely. There was a small amount left over, which she put against the long-term land note. Not much, but something. She did not tell anyone. She just drove home and made dinner and read one of Henri's old agricultural bulletins from 1971 that she'd found in a box in the barn, because he had made notes in the margins, and she was still learning the language he'd been speaking his whole life. The crisis, when it hit, did not come from the land. It came, as crises often do in farming, from somewhere far away where no one was getting their hands dirty. Interest rates in Canada climbed through 1989 and into the early 90s with a mechanical indifference to the people they were affecting. At the same time, beef prices softened in a way that was described in the agricultural press as a correction, a word that sounds technical and neutral until you are the one being corrected. Farms around Lac-Saint-Jean that had expanded on the strength of the 1980s, that had bought land on credit, upgraded equipment on 5-year notes, taken on operating lines that required a good year just to service, began to feel the strain by 1990. By 1991, it was no longer strain. It was crisis. Auction signs appeared on properties that had been in families for 3 generations. Men sat in the co-op with the specific stillness of people who have run out of options and are waiting to find out which one will be chosen for them. The banker who had once suggested a partial sale to Claire drove past her place more and more often in that year, she noticed. Her cattle were in good condition. Her fences were tight. The Massey, rebuilt and well tended, was visible in the yard, its sheet metal dented with decades of honest use, but its engine quiet and strong. Her land held. The debt was small and shrinking. Her name did not appear on any of the lists that were making their way around the county in those years. It was the spring of 1992 when Mr. Tangway came out to the farm, not to call in a loan or discuss a sale. He came in the early afternoon on a day when Claire was working on the baler again. A different issue this time, the knotters, which were missing their ties with an inconsistency that pointed to a timing adjustment, and she heard his car on the gravel and came out of the barn wiping her hands. He had aged in 5 years, the way men do when they have spent those years, helping people lose what they had hoped to keep. He stood by his car and looked at the fields, which were coming into their late spring green, and at the workshop where the tools were visible through the open door in their careful order, and at the tractor sitting beside the barn with the particular quietude of a machine that is resting, not broken. "I've been driving past here for a few years now," he said when she came up to him. Every time I go by, your place looks the same. Everything in its place. I do my best, Claire said. He shook his head slowly. I've been telling people about your father for months, not by name. I wouldn't do that, but I tell them there was a farmer in this county who believed debt was a kind of weather system. The kind you can't outrun. You can only build shelters against it. He paused. Henry understood things the rest of us forgot we were supposed to know. She looked at him evenly. He didn't think he was special for knowing them. He thought everyone used to know them and then stopped. Mr. Tangway nodded. He was quiet for a moment. I told you to sell, he said. I thought I was helping you. I thought I was being practical. You were, she said. You were being practical from where you were standing. The view was just different from mine. He looked at her, and then he reached out and shook her hand, the handshake of a man who has come to say something and has said it. I'm sorry I doubted you, he said. It was an honest apology. She accepted it as such. The second apology came that fall, from Mark. He came alone without her sister, which told her the visit was his idea. He pulled up in the pickup he'd bought during the better years, a truck that was now a few seasons past its prime and wearing the evidence. He got out and stood in the yard the way people stand when they are uncertain of their welcome, with their hands not quite knowing what to do. He had been working in construction, he told her. The housing market had also corrected. He was managing. He looked at the farm. He looked at the tidy fence lines and the solid barn and the woodpile stacked against the south wall of the house in the precise rows Henri had always kept it. He looked at it all for a long moment. At the funeral, he said, and then he stopped and started again. When I talked to you at the funeral, I thought I was being sensible. You were being sensible, she said again, and it was not absolution, but it was fairness, which is what she had to give. I told Joseline last year, he said, meaning her sister, that you were the most stubborn person I had ever met. He paused. I've been thinking about it since. I wasn't right about what I called it. It isn't stubborn. What you did here, it's something else. He looked at her. I'm sorry, Claire. I didn't believe in what you could do. I should have. The weight of the farm had not changed. The work had not become easier or shorter or less relentless. But standing in the yard in the October light, with the cattle moving quietly in the pasture behind the barn, she felt the completeness of something. Not victory. Something quieter than that. Vindication, maybe, though she had not been fighting anyone except the daily fact of the thing, the broken and the frozen and the tired and the almost not enough. She had never announced herself. She had simply continued. Now let me take you forward, not far by some measures, just 15 years, but far enough that the farm looks different in the ways that matter. It is 2007. Claire Beaumont is 47 years old. The lines on her face are the kind that come from weather and attention, not from worry, and there is a difference. The Massey Ferguson 165 is still in the workshop, now genuinely a piece of history, its restoration complete, and its engine rebuilt twice more in the years since Mr. Corriveau first walked her through it. She keeps it running because she can, and because she believes in knowing that she can. The farm is 900 acres. She never expanded. She never took on land she didn't need at terms she didn't trust. She improved what she had, year by year, season by season. The soil darker and richer now, the fields producing with a consistency that people in the county have begun to remark upon. Not the biggest operation in the region, not the most modern, but the one that held and held and held. Young people come to her now. Some of them are agricultural college graduates with certifications and laptops full of yield data. And they come with specific questions about soil health and rotation schedules, and she answers them from 40 years of watching the same fields, respond to the same choices made in slightly different ways each time. Some of them are young farmers who have inherited something they're not sure they can keep, and they come with the look she recognizes because she wore it once in the autumn of 1987, standing in a pasture with a set of keys. One afternoon in late September, she is in the workshop with her niece, Sophie, her sister's youngest, 19 years old, and recently decided that she wants to know how things work, and she is showing her Henri's green ledger books, not the new binders where Claire keeps her own records, but the originals, their covers worn to a softness that is almost textile now. Your grandfather, she tells Sophie, running her thumb along the edge of a page, kept everything in here, every repair, every decision, not because he had to, because he believed that a farm has a memory and someone has to be its keeper. She looks at her niece. People talk about data now, analytics, decision support systems. Henri would have understood all of that. He would have said, "Yes, exactly. This is what I've been doing since 1961, and here is the evidence." She hands Sophie a wrench and points to the knotters on the old baler, which she is showing her as a teaching exercise. "Before you touch that adjustment," she says, "I want you to run the machine slowly by hand and watch the full cycle. Don't look for what's wrong. Just watch it do what it does. When you understand what right looks like, wrong becomes obvious." Sophie watches. She is patient in the way young people are patient when they understand that what they're being given is real. Outside, the hayfields are going gold in the September afternoon. The cattle moving in their slow, deliberate way along the fence line that has been repaired and maintained and repaired again until it is more her work than anyone else's. The people who said she couldn't had long since revised their accounts. The banker had made his peace with her. Her brother-in-law had made his peace with her. The farm itself had never needed to make peace with her because she had come to it as a partner, not a problem to be solved. Henri had told her once, when she was young enough, that she hadn't fully understood it. The land doesn't reward ambition. It rewards attention. She had spent 20 years learning what he meant. She spent the next 20 years knowing. The work, as he had written in that note she still kept folded in her wallet, worn soft at the creases now, was not the burden. It never had been. The work was the answer, and she had been answering it, faithfully and carefully, and with her whole capable hands, ever since the afternoon she first turned that wrench alone in the dark of her father's workshop, with the light buzzing overhead, and the cattle settled, and the farm holding its breath to see what she would do next.